What is gluten and why should you avoid it? Well, before we start, I encourage you to get rid of most conventional notions of gluten because you're going to find out once you hear the full story that a lot of the things you hear about gluten are either untrue or half-truths or misleading. So what is gluten? Gluten is a very complex protein that occurs in wheat and related grains such as rye, barley, corn, and sundry oats. And it's comprised of two different parts, a globular gliadin protein and a long linear chain of repeating units called glutenin. It's a polymeric protein, or repeating units that are in a long chain. It's the glutenin that gives wheat dough its stretchiness, its viscoelasticity that allows a pizza maker, for instance, to toss the dough up in the air and make pizza crust, or to fashion dough into donuts and other unusual shapes that are unique to the wheat flour and dough. And those properties are conferred by the glutenin protein. Now, glutenin does have some problems when consumed by humans, but the primary source of problems in humans is not the glutenin so much as the gliadin protein. Now, there are 200 different forms of gliadin, and so you can imagine there's a whole variety of different effects of these various gliadin proteins. One thing we have to accept that is the recent efforts by farmers and agribusiness have changed the gliadin protein. One of the effects, for instance, of this change in gliadin protein sequence is a fourfold increase in celiac disease. So that's a big deal, right? Because celiac disease is a very serious business. And a fourfold increase from a change in the gliadin protein. And by the way, this is not my speculation. This is well borne out in the science. So the changes introduced by agribusiness into the gliadin protein structure have quadrupled the number of people with celiac disease. So that's one problem. Another problem is that the ancestral form of wheat, called einkorn wheat, that's the pre-biblical form of wheat, had only 14 chromosomes. But over the many thousands of years, the wheat plant has a very peculiar tendency to combine chromosomal units over and over again. So this doesn't happen in humans, right? If you have 46 chromosomes and your partner has 46 chromosomes, you have a child, an offspring. That child does not have 92 chromosomes, right? That child has 46 chromosomes, just like you and your partner. Well, plants like wheat don't have to follow that rule. Ancestral einkorn wheat had 14 chromosomes, but einkorn mated several times with other wild grasses, because that's what wheat is. It's a wild grass, or was a wild grass, no longer. And it acquired the chromosomal contents of two other grasses. And modern wheat, so-called triticum species, have 42 chromosomes, 3 sets of 14 chromosomes of various varieties. It means that the number of gliadin proteins coded in modern wheat are much more plentiful. There are many different forms of gliadin in modern wheat, increasing its potential for adverse effects, including provocation of celiac disease. So what are some of the other problems in the gliadin component of the gluten protein? Well, one problem is that gliadin is very difficult for humans to digest. No surprise, right? Because wheat, including the gliadin protein, are components of the seeds of grasses, and humans are not ruminants like goats and cows, and we don't have the digestive enzymes to break down the gliadin protein of wheat and other components of grasses. And so the best we can do with gliadin is break it down to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides rather than single amino acids like other proteins, like the proteins from eggs or, say, a piece of steak. So these 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides gain entry into the bloodstream and then gain entry into the brain, where they have a whole variety of brain effects. In people with a tendency towards ADHD, attention deficit disorder, or autistic spectrum disorder, it causes behavioral outbursts and abbreviates attention span. In people with a tendency towards paranoid schizophrenia, gliadin-derived opioid peptides cause paranoia and auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. Gliadin-derived opioid peptides cause obsessive behavior with tics and with food obsessions. People with bulimia and binge eating disorder, for instance, are provoked to have food obsessions 24 hours a day, the kind of food obsessions that puts them in front of a refrigerator at 3 a.m. gorging, then often purging. And gliadin-derived opioid peptides also cause addictive behavior with food. And that's why so many people have a hard time giving up wheat and grains, because they have an opioid addiction. It also means that when you stop eating wheat and grains, there's an opiate or opioid withdrawal. 5 to 7 days of nausea, headache, fatigue, depression. It's an obligatory process that you have to go through. Not everybody gets it. Only about half the people who go through a wheat and grain elimination get it. But you have to know about that. There's a withdrawal process. The gliadin protein of wheat and related grains also is now known to be the initiating step in many, if not most, autoimmune diseases, like rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes. The gliadin protein has the unique capacity to open the intestinal barriers between intestinal cells and opens the floodgates for inflammatory factors. And you can actually measure this phenomenon by an increase in the protein in the bloodstream called zonulin. That reflects an increase in intestinal permeability. This does not just happen in people with celiac disease. This essentially occurs in all humans, because the gliadin protein opens those tight junctions between intestinal cells regardless of whether you have celiac disease or not. And this is why wheat and related grains are so inflammatory, so inflammation provoking. Gliadin is also a very potent bowel toxin. It can cause intestinal damage, either as intact gliadin or as fragments, 4 or 5 amino acid long fragments. Gliadin is also causes massive sodium retention by the kidney. And that's why when people go wheat and grain free, they urinate a lot. We say they diurese and lose a lot of water and salt. So much so, in the first week of wheat and grain elimination, we encourage people to drink lots of water and salt their food, and maybe even salt their water lightly, because people sometimes even pass out from the massive loss of fluid that occurs. And you'll see this, by the way, because leg edema, or leg swelling, will reduce within days of wheat and grain elimination. You'll see it in people's faces. You'll see the bloating, the around the eye puffiness, the puffy cheeks, all receding within days of wheat and grain elimination. And that's from the drop in sodium retention from getting rid of the gliadin protein of wheat. So gluten is, yes, it's a protein that comprises about 10, 12, 14% of all the proteins in wheat, but it's not just about gluten sensitivity. It's not just about celiac disease. It's about a whole range of effects that applies to all humans, because these are not dependent on having the genetics for celiac disease. Now, buried in that realization is that you have access to an extraordinarily powerful strategy. Eat no wheat or grains, thereby no gluten or gliadin or glutenin. And that opens the door for huge improvements in health. Now, if you want more on how to do this, what to experience, how to soften the blow of withdrawal, and how to stack the odds in favor of reversing literally hundreds of health conditions, including hypertension, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, fatty liver, rosacea, psoriasis, eczema, seborrhea, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, etc., you'll find the entire program, my Wheat Belly program, updated, expanded in my new revised and expanded edition of Wheat Belly that's now on bookstore shelves.